Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple things set out here on the table, preparing to feed a couple of my worm bins, my two youngest red wiggler worm bins. I usually limit a given feeding for any one of my bins lately to about 2 handfuls of stuff per feeding. Not for any given reason, but just for some degree of consistency, so if I ever wanted to kind of reflect on how much any given bin has consumed over time, since I do keep track of how many feedings each bin has had, if I could somehow tie that to some sort of a average amount, then I might be able to eventually start guesstimating how much stuff has, in total gone into any one of my bins over the course of its lifetime. So, the only reason I bring that up is because it is a bit of a hardy feeding for only 2 systems, because this has got to be, maybe at least 1.5 times that much. And then in addition to what's already a little bit more than usual over here, I've got some leftover rice from the other day. It was just sitting out on the counter for a couple days, and I put it into the freezer along with the rest of my kitchen scraps, just because rice can get a little bit stinky if it starts to go bad out at room temperature. And the other stuff you see out here is just my other staple feeding stuff, like the used coffee that always adds up over time around here, the coffee filters. And what you see here is just pulverized eggshells. Every so often I let my collection of eggshells pile up, and then I get the old machine out and I start grinding it up in the little juice blender. So I'm going to put all this stuff aside so we can make a little space out here and get to feeding. The system that we're going to begin with here is the younger of the 2 systems, and it's only about, what, a month old, I say? Month and a half old. It's 38 days or something along those lines. I can't remember, 39 days. Sometimes I take little notes and come down here prepared to provide exact statistics on my bins in terms of their ages and the number of feedings they've received and other things, but today I didn't take the time to do that. I just figured I'd grab some stuff, shoot down here, give these little guys a quick feeding. I've been tending to a number of my bins in such a way that they didn't require feedings. Like some of my bins I've been just trying to air out, so I came down here the other day to spend some time agitating the material in those bins that I'm trying to air out. So that didn't really translate into the reduction of any of my kitchen scraps on that go around. I was also down here the other day to set up one of my systems for a migration to get the worms to start moving out of the finished castings, and that didn't translate into much of a feeding. I mean, I guess I did actually use some food in that case, but in a number of my current worm bin check-ins, I've not been getting the opportunity to deplete any of my accumulating kitchen scraps, so I'm glad to finally be down here with a tray of food for the worms. This piece of paper, you could tell it's really been beaten up. The worms definitely like nibbling away on this newspaper, and I'll do my best to try to keep that piece of newspaper on top intact for a while so I can keep reusing it. But over time it gets kind of beaten up, and eventually it just doesn't really hold up anymore, even under its own weight. So I've got a feeling that that piece of paper that we were covering up with might be history at this point. I'm trying to think what to cover up with though, because I don't really have another newspaper laying around. I wonder if I have anything upstairs. I just took recycling out the other day, because not everything makes it into my worm bins. And I don't even get any real newspapers sent to the house on a regular basis. When I do have newspaper around the house, it's usually stuff I salvage out of my mom's recycling bin. So if I could find something I can cover up with here at the end, then we'll throw that on, but if not, that's not the end of the world either. The coffee filter that you saw over here was just indicating where the last feeding occurred. And in all my red wiggler bins lately, I've been attempting something I've done in the past, but it had been a while since the last time I did it. So I figured I'd revive the tradition of corner feeding or pocket feeding. So I started a number of weeks ago out here in this top right corner. From my point of view, it's top right. From your perspective, it's lower left, I guess. But and then, you know, from there I started going in a clockwise circular pattern, alternating corners every feeding. So the most current feeding was indicated by that coffee filter here in this corner. But that was after we'd already made one complete circuit around the bin feeding. So we're now taking the second lap here. This is the second time we've fed down here in this corner, in this bin, in all my bins, I believe. And, you know, following that same pattern, today's feeding is going to be applied down here in this corner. Like we do sometimes, though, we'll check on how things are progressing in the bin elsewhere before we feed. And it's interesting to see because you can actually sort of track the progress of the breakdown of materials over time. I mean, if you were to put the same exact stuff into each corner, you could see how much breakdown occurred in, you know, say 1 week, if it was 1 week between feedings, after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, so on and so forth. In this case, it was 8 days ago since we last fed. I don't always keep to any sort of a strict schedule. Besides the pocket feeding, this bin is also a little bit special, a little different from the rest, because I'm trying something new here. I'm trying to compost fabrics, which is something I've never tried before. I've seen other people doing it with great success. Natural fibers such as cotton, wool, silk, all these can be consumed by the worms. So I figured, hey, I got this old beach towel here, and I'm going to throw it in there and see how it goes. So I did actually sort of spread it out all over the place down within this bin, and it's down low, and I've not really had a good look at it because I normally don't want to disturb the whole system and pull stuff out that you know, spreads across the entire system. But somehow I guess we ended up with a small fragment of it up here on the top. Here we've got some other stuff that actually, I believe, goes right back to the origin of the bin, right back to when it was built. This is a piece of egg carton. So this is just displaying progress over whatever its age is now, 38 or whatever days old, 39 days or thereabouts. And then some of these things too, like these are just the cut up chunks of toilet paper rolls or paper towel rolls, I'm not sure which, but they're pretty much the same, and they gradually start falling apart. I only use these chopped up toilet paper and paper towel rolls in my brand new bins, so we get a chance to see how they break down over time. As we work our way down, we can already see one of these little food bundles. Like you saw before, I'm using these coffee filters to put the food into, as sort of like a little wrap, if you will. I'm sure some of this stuff on the top is coffee. Usually this thing is like piled high with all kinds of veggies and kitchen scraps and stuff. And there might be some remaining bits and pieces in here, but for the most part it looks like it's been depleted, with the exception of maybe the coffee. Here's another one. I've been kind of doing that, like I said earlier, the 2-handful portioning. And each handful I try to place into some sort of a bedding supplement, because the paper, cardboard, all these sort of carbon-based materials all act as bedding in your worm bins. I wonder what's going on here. I guess maybe I had a third coffee filter bundle of food. Maybe I went really generous last time, or maybe there's just leftovers in here from going 4 feedings prior. I don't know. Here's some newspaper. We've got all kinds of stuff down here, as well as at the very bottom, a little collection of worms doing their thing right underneath where the feeding was last applied. So that's pretty promising. I'm not even sure what the population in these systems is, but I got a feeling that this particular system doesn't really have such a huge population. Down here you could see fragments of the old paper towel. So I like to poke around a little bit at some within some of these older feedings just to see how things are progressing, but We also don't want to take the entire day doing this stuff, so why don't we reassemble this feeding area and let them get back to work. Maybe I'm going to put that egg carton fragment down low so that some of the remaining food juices and moisture from this feeding can drip down onto it a little bit and maybe make that into a little bit more of a tempting piece of food. Here too, I can recognize what this is. This was like a little piece of origami that I had I had laying around, and I threw into the worm bin as part of its feeding. It's if you've ever done origami, then you'll know what the salt and pepper shaker is, the one that you can have the little game in, that you open up this way and that way with the two jaws that open up two ways. So I just left it as a single piece of paper, folded into its origami shape, and threw that into the bin too. As we start making our way back, we're encountering some of the other unusual things besides a towel, of which there's more of down here. You can see the red, but there's also a pine cone in here. One of two pine cones, not showing a lot of signs of wear yet. Hopefully soon we'll start to see something there. So now we're going back 8 days. I believe it was 7 days prior to that this portion was applied over here in this corner. Here too we're going to see similar stuff with portions of egg carton into which food was placed, and the food is at this point more or less history. As I go down, I can feel a little bit more moisture down at the bottom of this feeding area. Perhaps there was just more moist, more high moisture content foods applied down in here. Maybe that's why I'm sensing a little bit additional moisture down there. So let's just pile this collection of bedding that has piled up over here right on top of that feeding zone. And then we'll just take another quick look going further back in time now. Now we're encountering the other pine cone. Looks like there's a little bit of mold growing on it or whatever. I'm not expecting a lot of action on that pine cone, although a lot of people have been showing in their videos how they do feed their worm bins pine cones, and it does break down over time. So I just don't know what to expect as far as the amount of time it's going to take for it to completely break down. Down here too, you can see an abundant amount of bedding, paper, cardboard, leaves, you name it, all kinds of stuff that was probably dating all the way back to the origination of the bin a little bit over a month ago, 30 some odd days ago. And I guess since we're now circling back here, the excavation that we're performing is actually going to be not just to inspect the feeding from 1, 2, 3, 4 feedings ago, which could be about a month or so at this point. We're also going to, at this point, also apply the feeding for today into the hole that we create. Nope, I shouldn't yank on it. Here again, we're just seeing a piece of that towel. I did lay the towel out in such a way that it's sort of, you know, I folded it in half, then I bent it back, and I just didn't anticipate wanting to check in on it and examine its progress, so I'm okay just leaving it down there. And at some point in the future we'll do a greater upturning of the material in the bin so we can get a better view of what's happening down there. I've got a couple of these old coffee filters into which we can start applying today's feeding. But you know what I'm going to do is let's bring this over here. I'm worried I'm going to drop it. Let's see if I could use this to place it on top of without getting it all covered in debris. Not that it matters, I'll probably just take it over to the sink when we're finished and rinse it off anyway. But instead of using 2 coffee filters to apply the feeding with, we'll use 1 here for the first one. And then for the bedding supplement, oops, on the second handful, we'll just recycle that old newspaper that was doing the job of covering things on the bin. Or should we just try to see what we could do in terms of salvaging it? I mean, it was pretty tattered, but I think it can probably survive if we just carefully spread it out over the top again one more time. Yeah, let's do that. Even though it's kind of beaten up pretty hard, I think we will go ahead and just give it a little bit more time in service. So the second handful, you know, I'm just going to plop it in. Ooh. Okay, whatever. Maybe one other larger sized chunk like this end of a piece of vegetable. I think it's Coral Rob. They'll probably work away most of the material on that and leave the little stem for last, because that's probably a slightly tougher object. I also wanted to make sure I didn't forget to get rid of my leftover rice. Just a little starchy carbohydrate boost for them, which I believe the worms enjoy. And the other thing I like to include in some of my younger bins' feedings pretty regularly is the grit. As I mentioned earlier, it's just pulverized eggshells in my case, but if you're applying grit to the feedings of your worm bins, you could use pretty much any, you know, small-sized, coarse material to help the worms with their digestion. Stuff like sand or pulverized eggshells or oyster shells or rock dust. I don't know. There's all kinds of different things people use as bedding in their worm bins. Not bedding, I'm sorry. Grit in their worm bins. Okay, hopefully I didn't make too much of a mess here on the bottom of this thing. But that's where we're at with the feeding of my youngest bin. And it's not going to be my youngest bin for very long, because I'm in the process, as I mentioned earlier, of migrating worms out of one of my nearly finished systems. And I'll be setting up a new bin to relocate those worms into. But that migration has only been in progress for a few days. I'll probably check back in on that system in a few days to see how many of the worms have congregated into the feeding area that I built for them, and get them set up in a new home. And prior to that, I'll probably, in the next day or two, I'll probably have to get down here and build a new home for them too. Take one of my empty bus boxes and set it up as a new habitat for the worms. I don't know why I try so hard to preserve these things into multiple feedings. You know, most people would just say, hey, that's mostly bedding at this point. Throw it into the feeding and let it get broken down as bedding materials, as kind of a carbon supplement to their feeding. But I think we're okay here going one more go around. But next time, it's most likely that this piece of paper is just going to end up down in the feeding area with everything else we apply next time we're in here. So we're going to get this thing covered back up again. I've got a couple of these kind of funny little cardboard coverings which actually have plastic wrapping going around them. In most cases I just take a plastic bag and throw it on top, but here I decided I'll take the plastic and wrap it onto the cardboard. The whole idea there, I guess, was just to make the cardboard, to make the plastic a little bit more controllable, instead of it just being a loose piece of material that flops around and, you know, castings falling all over the place, flaking off of it. But I don't know. It's just one of my funny little experimental items. All right, on to the next bin. All right, so on our next oldest bin, I don't know, something tells me that there's a slightly larger population within this bin. Sometimes I try to estimate how many worms I'm placing into my bins when I'm populating them. And then I take little scribble scratch records in my tracking spreadsheet. I try to track certain bits of info about all my bins. And some of the information I track is pretty clear and accurate and dependable. Some of it is just sort of experimental. This poor worm here does not look too good. I mean, it's obviously not alive. It looks like it's actually in the process of being eaten or decomposing or whatever the case may be. I just assume that when something's decomposing in one of my worm bins, the process is primarily consumption, other creatures consuming it. So this piece of paper is clearly in much better shape than the one we just used in the previous bin to cover up with. So we'll have no problem reusing that one. And you can see we've got the same arrangement here. I've you know, I'm trying to keep to the same pattern, so this week it's always this corner here and all the bins that are being fed. So when we finish, we'll simply, you know, position this over here to indicate where we last fed. But for now, we'll just set this aside. And that piece of paper is getting pretty tattered too at this point, so it could also probably use replacement soon. In the bin that we just fed, I believe it's new enough that the pocket feeding that I'm doing in all these red wiggler bins was already in effect. So when the first feeding of that bin came around, I believe it did simply get right into the corner feeding pattern. But this bin, I believe, may have actually began prior to me starting into that pocket feeding stuff. At which point I was not yet feeding in the corners. I was just doing what I usually do in the past. What I was always doing was simply feeding down the middle. And a lot of people have expressed interest in seeing what's going on down the middle of my bins, where prior to pocket feeding there had actually been food placed in there. So here what we can actually do is, as we, you know, go back in time to see how previous feedings, getting older and older, are coming along, we can take a peek in there too before we apply today's feeding. So as you recall, the piece of paper indicating where we last fed was here, and I can still see kind of a mound suggesting that there's probably a little bit of leftover stuff in here still. I'm going to try not to disturb things too much. I'm assuming we're going to find similar stuff in here as what we saw in the other one. Good number of worms hanging out right below the feeding area. Stuff in the feeding zone looks like it's coming along pretty good. I think it's partially coffee piled in on top. This looks like a piece of banana peel. And then down low you find some other scraps of food. This is interesting. This is an avocado seed, but it's a material that you can actually slice. When an avocado seed is really fresh, the seed is really tough. And you would never think that you could just slice it up, but you can. I remember someone mentioning it, and before me even trying it, I was very skeptical, but then I figured I'd give it a go, and it's not too hard to do. So recently I've been trying to help the avocado seeds get broken down more quickly by significantly increasing their surface area by slicing them into little pieces. So we got 2 food bundles here, maybe even 3. Maybe we already got into the hearty feeding of these bins a week ago, because it does seem like the previous feeding did include 3 paper bundles with food in them. Although, you know, now that it's kind of coming back to me, I believe it was generous on the paper, but it might have still been consistent with the amount of food. I think just each paper bundle had a slightly less amount of food placed into it. So I think I took the customary 2 handfuls and just spread it evenly across 3 bundles. Somehow it's ringing a bell. I don't know why, but that could very well be what actually happened here last time, is why we're seeing 3 food bundles rather than just 2. So you can see there's worms hanging out here, taking advantage of the food, as well as some leftovers. And after 8 days, that's kind of what you would expect to see, right? So 8 days, prior to that was probably another 7 days or so. So this is 15 days of progress in a feeding area of red wigglers. I don't know why, but I think the estimate of worms in here is somewhere around the neighborhood of 1,200 or so. I haven't really been paying close attention to how many worms are in each of my bins lately, but I do have notes where I try to estimate. Most recently I've been trying to keep track a little bit better on that. And there too, a lot of times it's just a visual estimate, you know, look at what I've collected, and before relocating them, positioning them in their new home, I'll just take a rough guess, oftentimes with input from the viewers, trying to guess how many worms we've got there. So it's very rough figures. That's probably the main reason I don't get too much into talking about it, because a lot of times it's not numbers that I can really substantiate and support with strict evidence. Occasionally I weigh, you know, the worms when I have the chance to really sift through and pick out all the material surrounding them, and then I'm really left with just a pile of worms only. In those cases, I feel a little bit more confident equating the weight of the worms to their count. Because, you know, with red wigglers, at least I believe the rough estimate is that if you've got a pound of them, a pound of worms, then that equates to about 1,000 or so in terms of quantity. So here too, I'm just kind of blasting through at this point, checking out how things go in these older and older feeding areas. But once again, we're back to the corner that we're going to be feeding in today. Seems like it's still holding up good in terms of having a good hardy worm population in it. Here too, maybe we were really generous on the feeding this time, so the food is probably still remaining in here in abundance as far as leftovers go. I mean, here and there, I think I see something, I go to grab it, but it just feels like mush. So it could just be the mushy remains of something that was in here, food. Maybe it's just bedding that's been soaked with the juices of the food that was applied there, and they're eating the bedding. I don't know. It's hard to say. But it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool feeding this way, you know? You get this sense that there's kind of, you know, breakdown happening everywhere, and you really get a good chance to kind of share the wealth, share the fun. Some of the worms hang out in one place. There's no kind of overcrowding in any one particular area. There's plenty to go around for everyone. So here, if I'm not mistaken, you know, this worm bin might have actually been getting feedings down the middle over here prior to the pocket feeding getting set up. But I mean, after a month or more of time, I would have to guess that there's probably not a whole lot of remaining of it. And for that matter, not a lot of worms here either, or moisture for that matter. But I could be mistaken. I'm not 100% certain that this bin was getting fed down the middle prior to the pocket feedings. It is possible that this one may have already jumped right onto the pocket feeding pattern right from the get-go. But something tells me there might have actually been at least one feeding placed down the middle on this bin. Possibly its first feeding. So I don't know. Sometimes I'll review my older videos just to get a better handle on this sort of stuff, so I can provide more accurate details in my narration, but on this go-around, I'm sort of just winging it. So even though we saw a good amount of leftovers in here, or not, you know, not leftovers so much as just worms still seemingly working what appear to be leftovers, but here, for example, is a banana stem, which probably goes back over a month now. And it's getting broken down quite nicely. Worms squirming around within it, working it down, and probably not a whole lot else that could be recognized as what it had been when it was placed in here. So, like I said earlier, we've got paper to wrap our feeding into. So let's get it in here. Let's see what I could do about squeezing all of this food into these last two paper bundles. Here, besides the banana peels, we've also got kind of that butt end where the entire bunch of bananas ties together. I got a feeling that chunk right there is going to take a little time to break down. Good thing this is one of my newer bins. There should be ample time for that to occur, hopefully. Let's move this stuff back in where it belongs. Okay. Pretty nice. And I believe we've got a slightly smaller amount remaining to do away with here in this container. I think I got the majority of it. And drop it in. Very nice. Well, some people have suggested, you know, including the middle of the bin as one of the feeding zones in this rotating pattern. But I don't know. If it's really kind of corner feeding or pocket feeding, the middle doesn't really count so much as a pocket, if you're considering pocket as meaning sort of the pockets on a billiard table. Although, you know, in reality, the billiard table does have 2 pockets right down the middle. So I guess it would still be applicable. Oops, there we go. Once again, forgetting to add stuff that I was trying to get rid of, right? But I'm still early enough to catch my mistake and correct it. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just trying to get the job done already. But I wanted to include grit and rice and coffee also, making for a fairly generous feeding. Wow, definitely generous. Okay. I guess even if it's a generous feeding, you know, you don't really feel like you're crowding the food in or jamming excess food in when you get to that next corner, because that next corner goes, you know, many feedings back, and by the time we get back in here for the next feeding, this will be the place that we're going to be looking to add that feeding, and I won't feel so bad cramming even more food into here next week, because chances are there'll be very little of whatever is left in here remaining. And even though there'll be a whole bunch of leftovers here, we'll just be able to place that next feeding right into there. And I won't feel like I've got to wait, you know, extra time to allow for the food to get broken down further. Alrighty. Very nice. The material in this, you know, bin, even though it's not much older than the one we checked first, the first bin just really had a lot of paper and leaves and everything. Here it seems like there's a greater amount of castings, and I don't know if that's, you know, possibly because there's a greater number of worms in here, burning through more food than that other system, or if it's just the additional time that this bin has had to break down stuff, or maybe just a combination of both. But it is kind of cool to see older bins and how they're coming along. The newer bins aren't quite as exciting because they're still kind of full of all kinds of paper and bedding and stuff that is yet to be broken down. But whatever, you got to work your way through the young bins before you can get to having bins that are older in age, right? And you got to love them all equally. I don't know, that's not true. It's not like they're children or something. It's probably not a big ethical problem with playing favorites when it comes to your worm bins. Alright, I don't think there's anything left to do here. I've pretty much done away with all the food I intended to feed today, and we've got everything more or less packed up and ready to be put away. I've only got a little bit of cleanup to take care of around here, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.